Now the moon is really important when judging anyone's chart, because the moon represents our ego consciousness and our sense of individuality. So any planets that are influencing the moon, that's going to really define what we are comfortable with in life. And what do I mean by that? Basically, the moon has no enemies. And so that means unless the moon is with Saturn, where it would be starved, or unless it's with the sun, where it would be agitated, the moon is adaptable. It's going to work with whatever it's given. Now, that means that if the moon is with Jupiter or aspecting Jupiter, the moon's going to strongly identify with Jupiterian qualities, which means it's going to be a creative moon, it's going to be an optimistic moon, it's going to be a moon that can see the bigger picture, and so on. It'll be more comfortable with more peaceful, fun, jovial aspects of things. If the moon is with Saturn or in relationship to Saturn, the moon's still not going to be hurt, unless, of course, as I mentioned, he's starved by being in the same sign. The moon will adapt, which means the moon will get comfortable with being depressed, being focused on insecurities, being focused on the darker, more difficult things of life. And you might know people like that, people who, they're just more comfortable with that, the stress and the hardship. And when things are going well, they think that's wrong, or they think that there's something bad's going to happen. So depending on what planets are influencing the moon, that gives a really strong emphasis in regards to what the person is comfortable with in life. A few other examples: if the moon is with Mars or has a strong influence between the moon and Mars, this will show someone who's more comfortable with adventure, with change, with initiation, with even violence, or what's the word? Just the more, not scary, dangerous side of life. The person can be more comfortable with the more dangerous side of life, which means they'll do dangerous things. Maybe they'll go extreme mountain biking, or maybe if they're in a relationship, they're always sort of pushing the boundaries to keep it interesting. That's what they're comfortable with, that's what they like. Or they'll even choose relationships which are violent, because when they're not in those relationships, they won't think it's normal. And you'll find this when you work with clients, or you have friends that, for example, if Venus and the moon, if the moon and Mars are together, and especially dealing with the 7th house or 9th house with relationships, you might say something to them like, well, you must have some violent relationships or some abuse within your relationships. And they'll say, no, not really. But then if you get to know them and you actually hear how their relationships are, you realize, yes, there's some inappropriate violence within that relationship, but since they're used to it, they don't see it that way. So we always have to remember that whatever the moon's dealing with, or whatever the moon is influenced by or influencing, that's what it's used to. That's what it feels is normal within life. And this ought to really help you understand people too, because you might wonder, well, why are they that way? You think it's weird, but to them it's normal. They think you're weird. It's all because of what's influencing your moon. That's kind of a key to personality determination. Now, and basically, no one holds the moon back, and the moon will always adapt. So the ego, being the individualized consciousness, never wants to die, meaning it will do anything it can to survive. If that means adapting to negative situations, it's going to do it. If that means adapting to positive situations, it's going to do it. It's going to get comfortable with any situation. Now, we have to remember that the moon has no enemies, but it is enemies to other planets. So no one's an enemy towards it, but it is an enemy to others, specifically Saturn, Venus, and Mercury. And we'll get to that when we get to their Avashtas, because the moon can actually cause some serious problems for these other planets. Let's see here. Now, and one other thing is we have to remember is that when a moon is influenced by difficult or malefic planets, that doesn't mean it can't be effective in life. It just means that it's going to do it in the way that those planets indicate. So if a moon is influenced by Jupiter, it's going to do it in a happy way. If the moon is influenced by Mars, it means it's going to accomplish its goals in a cruel way, or a adventurous or dangerous way. If it's influenced by Saturn, it might be more harsh, and so on. So the moon will still get things done, even when influenced by negative planets, but it will do it in relation to what that planet represents. All right. Now, what happens when the moon is in an ashamed Avashta? So when the moon is ashamed, the moon is essentially, the person essentially is ashamed of their ego, of who they are, of their personality, of how they feel, because the moon rules that area of life, of our feelings and so on. If the moon is ashamed in the first house, difficult issues with the body and the appearance and how one looks, shame around it. If the moon is shamed in the fifth house, this will give shame around one's children, thoughts around one's children and feelings around one's children. If it's in the 10th house, it'll give shame around career and place in life. So whatever house it's in, that's where the ego is going to feel shame, where it's going to feel that it is less than what it could be, and it'll feel really bad about it. So usually we have strong feelings about that house in which the shame occurs. Now, if Saturn is involved in the shame, this is a little more difficult, because the person can just see all of their inabilities and their insecurities and weaknesses, and they don't feel they can do anything about it. So if the moon is shamed with Saturn, they just see all the negativity, and they're kind of a drag to be around, because this is the glass is always half empty, and it's probably not even half empty. It's probably broken and never had water in it in the first place. That's the extent of Saturn shaming the moon. The moon basically falls apart because it actually cannot adapt to the stress of Saturn. This is where serious mental illness can sometimes come into play if that Saturn is extremely strong. Let's see. Oh, the moon also represents one's moods and feelings. And so this can give a person who has a lot of shame around how they feel about things in life, or the moods that they have, which is kind of a cycle that feeds upon itself. And again, this is why it leads to sometimes serious depression. And when the moon is shamed, the person might feel that way, feel so terrible, but they don't show other people. So when you see this within a person's chart, this might not be something that they dramatize. It might be something that, if you know a person who just seems fine, and then one day you hear that they committed suicide, or that they did something else terrible to themselves, and you thought everything was great, it can be because of this shamed moon. When Mars shames the moon, this gives a person strong opinions about what the right thing to do is. And this causes shame because they cannot live up to those opinions, meaning they think and they tell everyone else how things should be, but then deep down inside they're hypocritical. They can't live up to those standards, and so they feel shameful themselves. When K2 is included within the shame, the person often feels that it should be easier for them to live up to these standards, or that they are better than that. Like, they should be able to very easily live up to these standards, and when they don't, then they beat themselves up because they're not as good as they think they should be. It should be easy. When Rahu is causing the shame with Mars, this allows a person's opinions and thoughts about others to get out of control, which means that they can go on a wild tangent and talking about how things should be, being fanatical and so on, accusing other people of their rights and their wrongs. I would imagine a lot of religious fanatics can often have this. So K2 creates shame in regards to things being easier or better than they actually are. And Rahu creates shame to where things get out of control, and there's a fanatic aspect involved. Now, as we mentioned, even when the moon is in some of these avashtas, it can still produce. And so the moon could still do a good job. Like, they could still be an attractive person, or they could still do very well with their career, or they could even raise their children right, and their children could be just perfect. But when we have Mars shaming the moon, the person just never feels like it's good enough. It's never a good enough job. So always remember that. The moon is the ego, Mars is should and shouldn't. So we put this together, we often get someone who can never be pleased because the standards are too high.